Welcome to this LAS annual meeting panel on brand management and valuation. I am Brian Buss. I'm a founding principal of Nevium Intellectual Property Consultants and one of the three panelists. I specialize in intellectual property valuation, providing strategic analysis for IP-driven opportunities, and I provide expert testimony in IP litigation. I'll let the other panelists introduce themselves.
Mark Schwartz. I'm a Chief Operating Officer at Bob Mackey Design Group. We're brand owner, IP driven, basically, trademarks and copyrights. I've been LES member for many years, and my background's in intellectual property as an attorney and also in finance. So this whole world of valuation deal making is all kind of right in my area, though I'm speaking from the corporate side today.
All right, Walter.
Hey, I'm Walter Welsh, and my firm is Welsh IP Law. I'm a patent and trademark attorney. I'm based in Connecticut, and my practice focuses on both prosecution and litigation. I do a lot of representation of mid-sized companies, advising them on their IP, but as part of that, there's growth and acquisitions, and licensing becomes a big and important part of that. And I've met Brian through some networking groups, and we've done some work together, and I've met Mark through this. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
All right, thank you, everybody. So moving right along, because we do have somewhat limited time, we hope to cover these topics today. I won't necessarily read off the topics, but our intent is to leave some knowledge and some tools about brand management and valuation for you listening to the panel. And then at the end, there will obviously be an opportunity for some question and answer to revisit some of the topics or discussion points that we bring up today. So moving right along, jumping right into our first topic. Really, so what is your brand worth? And the concept here is how would anyone respond if some individual like a key investor or the chairman of the board or the chief executive or an outside party randomly asks, hey, what is our brand? What are those assets worth? And how does our brand do? What does our brand do for our business? How does it help us? So, if you're any role as a business executive, a consultant, an attorney, a business manager, how would you respond to those questions? So to jump right in, panelists, any thoughts on how to respond when that question comes up? What is our brand? What is it worth? And what does it do?
The first thing that we would do, just from a trademark attorney's perspective, is just to understand what brands do you have as a business, right? And typically this will be done with the sale of like a division or a business, but I think it's also a useful thing to do, either internally or through counsel. But what is a trademark or a brand? It's really anything that indicates the source of your business, that that your consumers associate with your business. And there can be different levels of brands. If you think, for example, like Subway restaurants, right? That'd be like a house mark. And then you could think about, they have different levels. Like they might have product marks, like the Italian BMT. That'd be a trademark. They might also have like slogans. So you could have Eat Fresh would be a trademark. But then you also have things such as domain names, right? So subway.com, and you also have social accounts. And so typically, I think it's important to review those and identify them. I think the second part, though, that's really important internally is to look at these and identify, all right, which are the more valuable ones and which are the less valuable ones. And I think it's obvious, right, that your house mark is probably going to be the most valuable to the business, and product marks and mottos or slogans might have different values. But I think once you have an objective understanding of this, it really is going to inform the business and how what's going to become our enforcement strategy, right? Our protection strategy and our licensing strategy, right? And how once we kind of have an understanding of what the value is, it really will inform the business the best way to kind of go into like determining what the value is and how do we capitalize on that. So I think this is just a initial step that should be taken, and then we can proceed from here.
There's really the initial step is doing a bit of triage just to figure out what those assets are. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think it's, look, I'm usually doing this for companies when they're trying to sell something, right? And we're trying to put it together at the last minute, and you find out, right, that like the web developer from 10 years ago owns the domain name address. But if you can, those are very valuable assets, right? And if you can stay on top of that, it's going to make things a lot more smooth.
Mark, any comments?
That's an excellent point, and I think I'd want to share, really to follow up on the two of you. We know ourselves internally. It's a constant review. I mean, whether you call it an audit, an IP audit, or just a review. If your business if your business has a licensing component, then clearly the trademark and copyrights in our case are vital. So you better protect that. You better look at it, protect it every which way, make sure your use of social media, use by licensees, certainly domain names are really, really protected and monitored. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later on quality control, use of the mark, but you really have to have all eyes out all the time, because that's you must protect that brand. That's your value. So, but on the licensing component, since this is really an LES event, that's part and parcel of your business. So you really better protect it and know what you have and what you need to do in order to correct something that may have gone wrong, 10 years ago.
And much better to know if something's going wrong way before that transaction opportunity comes up, as opposed to, hey, all of a sudden here's this opportunity, and to get that opportunity interfered with because
yes,
you're missing a domain name or a key element of the trademark portfolio.
And it will come up in due diligence on a deal. It will come up in a lending situation with a bank. They'll find it and they'll question you, and then you're scrambling. So better to do it preemptively.
And a little bit of proactive management rather than waiting to cure things once you're set.
And keep it as an ongoing part of your business, I think, either internally if you have the ability or with counsel.
Right. And then obviously once you've kind of identified what those assets are, the next question comes to, well, how do you determine the relative value, or how do you understand the relative value of each of those different elements of your brand and trademark portfolio? So if you guys have any thoughts, chime in, please.
Please, Walter.
So I have more of like kind of the procedural aspect of it, right? But I think that what I just from a trademark attorney's perspective, I looked at what I asked my client, what's driving the business to your brand, right? And I think that if it's like some model name or product name or motto, right, that's secondary or maybe tertiary, right? Maybe we don't need to invest a lot of money in protecting that relative to your house brand, right? That is essential to generating that revenue.
Agreed.
Yeah, sorry. Well, from a valuation perspective, there's a couple of key considerations as that conversation shifts from what is our brand to what is the value and contribution of those assets. And like we've already discussed, brand is really a collection of different assets and intellectual property rights. There's website domains, marks, and then the more intangible things like reputation and loyalty. And then another key consideration that every brand is somewhat unique by definition. You know, your brand is going to be different and have different elements to it than brands at comparable businesses. Even comparable companies in the same industry may
Right.
not have all the same assets. But then from a valuation perspective, there's always two contexts in valuing brand assets. There's the context of what someone else would pay to use your brand. You know, that's the licensing context or the acquisition context, where you're looking at, hey, if we let someone else use our brand, what should we charge? Or if you want to use someone else's brand assets, what would you be willing to pay to compensate them for that use? Then the other context, which is very different and can come up with very different valuation answers, would be, what does our brand do for us, right? So it's not what someone else is willing to pay, but how does the brand contribute to additional sales or save the company costs or enable the company to sell a greater volume of products? So that contribution context can be very different from the licensing or the acquisition context.
Very much so. And I think today, especially, you know, there may be brands that are more suitable for e-commerce sales than they would have been at, brick and mortar. So I think collectively, you may look at each asset or each brand a little bit differently now. Maybe there's a brick and mortar component, but that will fade over time. That's it's already peaked, where you have more potential on the e-com side, and the sales may not quite be there yet with that particular brand, but the potential is there. So, you know, you may, if you're pricing it for a sale, let's say, you may say, well, the sales may not be there, but the potential is, so therefore a multiple of something may be warranted. You know, there's so much, as we all know, there's so much intangible to pricing, especially when it comes to brands.
Yeah, and remembering that you're one of the key things when that question, you know, our hypothetical question comes up. The chairman of the board said, "Hey, what is our brand and how much is it worth?" Well, probably the first response should be, well, what context are we considering? Are we going to license this? Are you interested in licensing the brand or using the brand to extend into new markets? Or are we more concerned with how does the brand contribute to our current business?
That's right.
Because that context will then guide the rest of the analysis and investigation into understanding what the brand is and how much it's worth.
And and also the people involved. You know, a lot of times it's implied that, you know, a certain team will always be in place, but, you know, as we all know, with a corporation, it lives on, and sometimes a change of a creative person, or of a, you know, could be creative from a design standpoint or just innovative standpoint. Certain people leave, their team leaves, very different company. So same brand, different future. So I think, I know I would look at a situation like that and say, well, let's look a little deeper here based on personnel.
All right. So to kind of continuing to wrap up this topic of, hey, how do you answer the question of what is our brand and what is it worth? I think another key process or a key takeaway would be to understand the company's brand. Input's going to be required from multiple business functions, because brand is really a collection of what the company stands for and an identifier of what the company is. So that could require input from, you know, development, legal, marketing, finance. And you also need to understand the company's non-brand assets, the patent, relationships, and, as Mark said, the contribution and importance of people. So, you know, this brand valuation concept really becomes kind of a very holistic review of the company's operations, both its all its different functions and all its different resources.
I agree 100%. I'll certainly let Walter share his thoughts on the legal aspects, because that's, you know, depending on the asset or the intellectual property asset, there may be rights that expire patent, copyright, trademark, not so much, of course, but it's really where does it go? Look at the dynamics of the world. It's a digital world. Are things changing? Are certain things getting obsolete? So that may not be necessarily a legal opinion. It may be a marketing or a geopolitical input. So I think you need input from all aspects, all areas of the company, if you're going to get a full analysis.
All right, moving on to topic number 2 for today. Some key definitions and terminology. And despite the concept of understanding brand management and valuation has been a topic for a long time, and but however, there does seem to be quite a lot of different definitions and terms. So one of the goals of our panel today was to provide some input on the best use of all the different terminology around brand and trademark. So launching right in, and guys, feel free to chime in with stories and situations about how some maybe a misinterpretation of some of these terms led to confusion or led to problems, and how that can be cleared up or avoided in the future. But there is a difference between brand evaluation with an E and brand valuation with a V. So evaluation is really the top part of all this chart, all the metrics and measurements, awareness and recognition that roll up into things like brand score, brand strength, and brand equity. So in other words, a brand equity measure should consider different metrics that are important to that business and its brand. Then once those evaluations have been developed, contribution is, how does the brand impact financial performance? Does it drive additional sales? Does it save costs? A strong brand could reduce a company's need to have a lot of sales and selling activities, because the brand introduces the product to new markets. Then valuation is calculating the present value of those future benefits. Then understanding, those contexts and brand strategy is, how do you go about changing those metrics so that you get different measurements, a change in contribution, and hopefully a change in valuation. So just that kind of difference between evaluation and valuation. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, when someone external asks that question, what is our brand worth? What is its value? They may not necessarily be saying valuation. They may be referring to a lot of evaluation concepts.
Right. I think, again, it's going back to back to part 1 of our conversation. I think you're looking at it from so many different aspects. Where is their opportunity with the brand? Are there sub-brands that may make sense now? Are there other brands that are there for either defensive purposes or just, I don't know, just to save costs if possible? I mean, there's always many reasons, and you may not be able to put a dollar figure on any of it, but collectively it adds to that ultimate brand strength. Again, it's I think within the organization, especially when it comes to marketing, where should the money be spent? I mean, this day and age, do certain ads make sense in print? Do certain ads make sense only on social media and digital? And I think that conversation is happening everywhere right now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times these kind of metrics and measurements are often left to the marketing, the classic marketing function of the business. But there's a big legal and even a product development aspect to this, right? In other words, if you're working on new innovations and thinking about new products, some of these metrics and measurements might be important to consider early on, but equally, how do you make sure from a legal perspective that all the assets that you're hoping achieve great metrics are protected? And so I was kind of, is there any, from you guys as both Walter and Mark, as from your legal backgrounds, what kind of legal perspectives would you add to these typically considered marketing dimensions?
Well, from my perspective, the legal perspective, I think, people always come in with like a marketing idea that they love, and I don't think it has a lot of value when you bring it in, right? Because there's no association with the public, right? It has value in the marketing team's mind. But my question is, can we protect it, right? Can you have exclusive rights in this? And I always say, like, all right, well, like, if you can, that's great. If you can't, I always recommend that you should identify something that you can use exclusively. Because once you start putting value into something, I think that the hardest thing to do for a company is to pivot, right? Because then you lose a lot of that, any goodwill that you've built up into that name that you have to get away. And so that's one of the things I always focus on. And the second I think is important is to, like, well, even if that does occur, what's the pivot strategy? And sometimes there might be two marks associated with a product, right? And how are we going to do that in the least, the way that's going to affect the company the least, or the brand the least? And so I think when people are developing new ideas or looking to invest in new products or build a marketing campaign, and those are the things that I want to ask. And so when we look for exclusive protection, we're asking, like, does anyone else use a mark or a brand that's likely to cause confusion with us in the marketplace from the perspective of the consumer?
Yeah, that's a great point. We're going through something similar, but being an attorney on my end, wearing different hats, usually people get excited over something. They have an idea. It may be for a product with that brand, or it may be a new brand or a sub brand, and they love it. It just makes perfect sense. And you must, and I know myself, I go to my trademark counsel, as I'm doing right now, to say, this was a mark that was abandoned. What does that mean? There's still a website. Before we invest in this and put our heart and soul into it and develop product and marketing, what is our chance of having this mark, be strong and not be attacked? So I think you must include legal early. And I think people don't. They get very excited over an idea and they run with it. And by the time they go to see the attorney, it may be so far gone that, when Walter says, can't do it, they're upset. They don't want to pivot. And Walter doesn't have an answer for them, except you can't do it. It doesn't work that way. So you must, get your ducks lined up in a row, and have legal counsel say, yes, you're free and clear, or there may be somebody out there that may infringe on a mark, or you may be infringing on them, but it probably isn't a problem. It may be worth taking a chance. But I think too many people jump in, get excited, and then have to pull right back. So they speak to your counsel, get good advice.
So just a few other terms that you see thrown around in brand discussions. There's the International Standards Organization has published 2 documents that are standards and guidelines for doing the evaluation analysis, and a second one for doing the valuation analysis. So just simply typing in ISO 20671 or ISO 10668 in an internet search, you can actually find these 2 standards and guidelines for how to do these analyses. And both of them are relatively consistent in saying you need to have a financial perspective, you need to have a marketing perspective, you definitely have to have a legal perspective in order to effectively do either analysis. So, once again, understanding brand really does require getting input from all the different elements of the business. And I think that's a great practice. It's a great opportunity for any business, large or small, to really consider how its different functions are interacting together to build what can be a very powerful asset, which is brand.
No question. I think for most businesses are really brand driven, unless you're just a I don't know, you make widgets, you make whatever, that's just a commodity. But even then, you probably have a reputation associated with your company that is your brand. Even if you're not selling that brand to the public, it's still a brand on a B2B basis. So I think that, branding is certainly relevant in most businesses, and even if people don't realize it.
All right, keeping our relatively short session moving. Topic number 3, the brand management toolkit. So we're hoping to leave the audience with a few tools for creating evidence-based strategic brand conversations. And I do think it's important, elevating that brand conversation within the company. One, brings the different company functions together to understand how they're all working together. But those conversations should be evidence-based. So we need some frameworks for collecting that evidence that elevates those conversations. So a quick kind of assignment once again, how much is our brand worth to us? And so here's kind of another valuation framework, and I'm sure that most people in the audience have heard these things before. There's basically 3 approaches to valuation: the cost, market, and income approach. Each looks at valuation in a different way. Now, when you're trying to ask that question, how much is our brand worth to us? Remember, this is just one of those 2 contexts. We'll cover that licensing and transaction context a few slides down the road. But really, your brand's worth to you isn't necessarily how much you've spent in terms of marketing. You might want to use that as a benchmark, but thinking, hey, we've invested $1 million is not answering that question, because that doesn't measure how your brand is contributing to the company. And if you think about the market approach to valuation, it's not really answering the question, right? If you're looking at what other brands are worth or what other companies have paid for other brands or using industry benchmarks, you're not answering the question about how the brand is contributing to your own business. You're just looking at other transactions involving what could be different sets of assets. So really what you need to look at is the income approach, right? How do you measure those benefits that owning and managing your brand contribute to your business? So that's focusing on how the brand impacts sales, impacts the volume of goods sold, or impacts the cost to do business, oftentimes your marketing costs. So what are the specific amount of profits from increased sales, lower costs, or greater volumes that are due to your use of your brand assets? And so, to focus on that income approach means you've got to get a little bit analytical. You've got to dive into some financial aspects, but then understand how the marketing and product development and even legal drivers are impacting your business to create those profits.
Yeah, Brian, you're dealing with this, sometimes on the litigation side. Are you finding a preference to either of any of the 3 approaches, or some being rejected? I'm curious.
Well, in litigation, there's a little bit of a run to safety by using what's kind of a relief from royalty approach, right? Hey, if other people have paid a royalty to use a trademark, and you're talking about confusion or trademark infringement or correct a misuse of a mark to label a product, and that kind of market-driven approach, hey, if we use other transactions, we'll be on solid ground, can cause some trouble, right? Because you really haven't measured what the impact of the brand is at the company that's in litigation. You've just used benchmarks, which may be very different assets.
I think also it depends, well, certainly depends on which side of the equation you're on. I mean, are you trying to raise the valuation or lower the valuation? Certainly if you're negotiating to purchase the asset, you may want to show that it's not quite as valuable as you think it is. But then again, we all know, I learned this years ago, what is something worth? It's worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it. So, ultimately, how do you get there? How do you get to that number that, everybody's on the same page?
Right, and remember, the purpose of our panel is to kind of elevate these conversations when they come up, right? So it's good to gather those benchmarks and guideline transactions, to understand what other brands have generated in a licensing context in terms of a royalty or a profit share. But you also need to then turn the conversation and say, hey, there's some additional facts we need. We need to focus on how is our brand changing our performance. So you add that to the conversation to have a more thorough and evidence-based conversation.
And I think that comes up, and it's happened with me, and I've seen it often enough in, if you're trying to approach a lender for financing and your assets are intangible. A lot of bankers were not comfortable with looking at intangible assets. They want to see, factories and product. But when your business is primarily based on intellectual property, you have to show how valuable it is. And yes, the income method without question is looked at. It generates X dollars in revenue, projected life of that of that brand in that category, what happens with other categories, can it extend? But I think I think you have to look at other, is that brand the brand for the company, or are there different brands? You can have, well, certainly a Procter and Gamble with so many brands. Some are more valuable than others. A Nike is Nike, Coke is Coke, but there are so many. Some brands just have more value now today than it might in the future. So they're intangible assets, but the analysis has an intangible factor as well, I find.
And to elevate the conversation, which is the goal of using more tools, if you rely on just one valuation approach, you haven't really elevated the conversation. So that's where it's important to at least consider the cost approach. Hey, what has been spent? What might we need to spend to do a replacement effort? Right. Or how have we booked these assets in the past? As opposed to just relying on the income approach. You need, compare the income approach result of your analysis to the result of your cost approach analysis and your market approach analysis, because the three different approaches could provide different indications of value, and that creates a more thorough and evidence-based discussion in itself. Why did we get these three different answers? What is it about the inputs we're using in each of these analyses that drives that answer? Those are great strategic conversations to have amongst the different functions of the business.
I think the cost part is quite relevant. I learned this years ago. Figuring out what doesn't work is sometimes even more valuable than figuring out what does work, because you know what path to not go down. And if you've tested correctly, some people do it, but they didn't do it right. But others have tested, I tried this. It didn't work, or it didn't return how as well as we hoped, but we went down another path and that was better. And I think that's invaluable. You sometimes you can put a price on it because you had labor costs, you had other, maybe it could be marketing, product development, and it just didn't work. And I think that is very important and very valuable to the whole conversation.
This is interesting. I mean, this is, from my practice, like I usually ask people like you guys to come and assist me with this, right? But just, looking at the different methods of doing it, I can think about clients that I have, particularly in e-commerce and new businesses where, the value of the cost of building their brand, right, 3 years ago might be significantly different than it is today, just because of the number of people competing in a certain field, right? And, it's very dynamic. And, I can, and I understand, like a judge or a jury, they understand the reasonable royalty, right? Or what have other people paid? Because that makes sense. But, looking at those other factors, I think can significantly change that value, particularly with today's market.
That's a good point.
And the market approach, in a way, is somewhat backwards looking, right? It's looking at what people have paid yesterday. And times change, what someone paid pre-COVID for a restaurant could be very different for what someone would pay, post-COVID, right? So, that's why it can be dangerous to just rely on one approach. So
Agreed.
focusing a little bit on the income approach, where you have to go make, basically the general concept of the income approach is you have to be forward looking. The income approach is based on the present value of future benefits. So how do you figure out those future benefits? And this comes down to forecasting. And when you're dealing with intellectual property assets, there's a few extra challenges and wrinkles in the whole forecasting, right? IP and the products that depend on IP have lifespans. So typically you'll think of a business as being a going concern that might operate into perpetuity, but most products grow, plateau, and then decline. And so you have to kind of consider that whole process of growth, plateauing, and declining in the forecast. And for some products, that lifespan, that curve of their lifespan can be very brief. Some it could be very long. IP could contribute to current products and future products, but at different levels, right? If you've got, an existing product brand, it might really be making a contribution to the product that uses it today, but you could build future products that would use those product brands and their own newly created brands. So there'd be a lesser contribution.
I think, no, but I think you're spot on, but I think with any given brand, you probably have multiple products sold under that brand, and each one has its own life cycle. So one is here and one is there, and this one's just launching. So your analysis is multifaceted.
Yeah, and you have to kind of the real takeaway here is you've got to consider that curve, right? That the asset may have value even though some cash flows are negative initially as you're building the product and making the initial investments. But then the cash flows, will start to grow. And then the asset value may start to decline as you start to expect lower and lower cash flows from the products that use that IP.
And it may have less investment at that point also. So your investment in the product may go down, or in the brand, but the revenues are steady. So, but you have a better there's a better profit margin there internally.
And really one of the benefits of brand, kind of think about it, if I'm looking at this bottom left-hand chart, brand through reputation and recognition and awareness of the product can serve to extend the width of the product life cycle, right? To keep that product relevant for longer. So, a strong brand can, through reputation and loyalty, can enable a company to generate more cash flows through a longer life cycle of that product. And that's the benefit of doing all those brand management steps to build a strong brand so that the company can reap the rewards through a broader product life cycle. Right, we're pushing for time here, so I'm trying to make sure we cover all the topics.
Let's do that. Yes.
Yeah, I probably won't spend a whole lot of time on this chart, but once again, this chart reiterates the idea that brand interacts with all the other company's assets and resources. So when thinking about the value of brand, it is important to understand how brand contributes to the different revenue sources of the business, but also how all the other IP, intangible and physical or tangible assets contribute to that business. In other words, brand does not operate alone. Just owning a portfolio of trademarks and domain names without all the other resources, you won't have any sales or profits. A brand doesn't do anything on its own. Okay, our last topic, the brand transaction. So how do we use all this newfound knowledge and toolkit to really help people, drive transactions around their brands? So this is kind of the quick financial construct of a license, right? There's actually three parties: licensor, the party that owns the asset, the licensee, and the customer, the product, the company, the end party who's going to buy the product that was created by the licensee using the IP owned by the licensor. So from a financial perspective, we actually kind of have to consider not just the interaction between licensor and licensee, but how much revenue and profit can the licensee generate by selling that product to the customer? So, I think one key takeaway would be to remember it's not just a world between licensor and licensee. There's actually that third level. And if there's no revenue from the customer for the product, the whole license concept really kind of falls apart.
That's it exactly. It starts with the customer. What does the customer need? Are you giving them? Are you providing something that they need, or they think they don't think they need it yet, but you think they need it. But I think if you don't take the customer into account, especially today, you have nothing. So you can have a great brand, great licensee, but if you don't take into account what the customer needs, and if is there an opening in that marketplace for you and that product, it will not work, or you'll be very disappointed.
Yeah, and the relationship between licensor and licensee is often governed by, a contract, a license agreement. The licensee customer relationship is often much more fluid, but that's where the brand has its power, is driving the customer to provide more revenue to the licensee.
Exactly, and that's what makes the licensee enticed, to come to you as licensor and say, I want to do a deal with you because I feel your brand can open up doors for us to sell product and build and hopefully build an ongoing business. I mean, we all hope that we have on the licensor side that we have find licensees that stay with us for many, many years. You don't want to keep changing. You want to find somebody good, and you really establish. Forget about a license relation, but it's a partnership, joint venture. Really, it's close-knit, really a close-knit relationship.
Yeah, and as licensor or as licensee, you really do need to look at the counterparty in that transaction as a partner, right? So it's almost, understanding their ability to perform. That license agreement has commitments and responsibilities on both parties. So from a legal, from a business, from a marketing, and even a product development perspective, you have to be able to understand how your partner in that arrangement is going to be able to fulfill their commitments through that relationship.
And it's vital, in your brand, your reputation and brand are one and the same. And you're permitting a third party to possibly affect that relationship, or that reputation, positively or negatively. And so it must be taken very seriously. I think sometimes people get caught up just in numbers, and that's important, but it's not the whole conversation.
One of the things I'm sorry, go ahead, Walter.
No, go ahead, Brian, and then I'll follow up after that.
I mean, one of the things that we often see that leads to problems once licenses exist is that concept that how will licensors support the brand assets that are going to be used by the licensee? So in other words, if a customer has complaints or there's negative social media reviews about the product, that can impact the brand's assets that are owned by licensor. So whose responsibility is it to deal with those? Licensee who's selling the product, or licensor who owns the brand, right? There's now, instead of one party knowing exactly how to go jump on a problem, you've got to have some interaction between two different parties, licensor and licensee.
No question. It's imperative.
Yeah, I mean, I was and just looking at this model. I mean, obviously, right? If you're the licensor, you want your licensee to succeed, unless they're paying you a paid-up royalty in the front, which I've never seen happen on a trademark, right?
Yeah.
And finding that number, and a lot of the times too, to Mark's point, is that when people get in a longer-term relationship, there's some trust, right? And so that will allow the royalty rate to float a little bit, or to find a spot where both parties are either unhappy, right? Maybe, or both parties are happy, but it's in that number where I think both parties are making money. And then control of the brand is essential. I know we have some slides on that now, but including that in the agreement, but also exercising that control, right? So, I mean, there's two things on that, right? That's making sure that the trademarks, right, are put on the product or the packaging, right? But it's also, has a right to quality control, right? And what's that? How are the consumers perceiving that brand through those products? And maintaining that or maintaining consistency with that is important, right, to that value of the brand and maintaining or growing that value.
100%.
All right, last, we're down to just a few slides here, so we're racing through, but there is the whole kind of concept of where do you set the royalty? And this gets into both the concept of benchmarking, but also creating a transaction. There's different levels of financial performance. Really, you can pay a compensation to use brand assets or any IP asset based on different levels from volume to net profits. Typically, it's done on sales. Often because that's kind of the easiest measure to get, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So a profit sharing license is very different from a volume license or a sales license. And it's important to kind of understand the differences there, but also the level of risk, right? So if the license is paid on sales, that's typically better for the licensor. But if the license is paid on some measure of profits, that's a little bit better for the licensee, because the licensee has a little bit more control over what types of expenses can be considered in that product's performance.
Right. I think you're seeing more of that today, where a lot of these deals are. I mean, even when it comes down to explaining deals that we're involved with, I always approached it as a partnership, and most are joint venture like, because we take on certain responsibilities in the deal that maybe another licensor wouldn't. But I think today in this environment, nobody wants to write these deals where there's all this guaranteed money. There's a lot of things are in test mode. So, you can say, well, let's agree to test it. We'll work for maybe less royalty up front, but if it works and we put our heart and soul into it together, maybe then we can make a little more on the back end. So the royalty may move. It may not be, it's sort of like a profit sharing arrangement, but not quite based on net profits. But there's flexibility. And again, to your point earlier, to both your points, it's based on trust. I mean, you've got to establish, it's a relationship. You're establishing trust between the parties. I work with you, you work with me. Let's make this work, and then we'll both benefit.
All right, one last topic to wrap up our conversation. Some legal considerations for licensing. So I'll let you guys take this one away. Close us out.
I mean, I think this is kind of this is what I alluded to earlier, right? But control of the trademark is essential, and that's got to be retained with the licensor. And so the worst case scenario is that the court could find that you abandon the trademark if you let somebody else use it, but you're not controlling that. And in context, even if it's like an intra-company license, so maybe sister corporations, there still needs to be, written agreements in place and somebody actually exercising control and reviewing the documents. And, some companies are always concerned about, well, we don't, it's not going to become a franchise, but that's easy to work with. But right, you're not going to control your licensee's business, but just how they use the trademark. And again, I think it's important too, like, terms covering how that trademark is used, right? And this goes to Brian's point too, maybe about the complaints, right, or the social media reviews, which are becoming essential for a lot of businesses right now. You see that, what's the review for their products? It's on everything. Well, how do we address that? And that's finding its way into agreements.
It's a huge point, Walter. It's enormous. It always has been, but especially now. You could lose your trademark rights. People don't realize that. You just can't let anybody run willy-nilly, you run the risk of losing that mark. Even though you have a registration, people don't quite get that you can lose rights even though you have a federal registration. So
yeah, there really needs to be some in responding to things like social media reviews, or reviews on Amazon product pages, which can have a huge impact on the volume of and awareness of the product. There needs to be some agreement between licensor and licensee on how they will interact with that evolving universe of dealing with reviews. If your product's sales depend on being placed well on Amazon or another online marketplace, your ability to respond to those reviews and comments could be huge.
And you as the licensor must take control of that, because the licensee may not care.
Yeah.
It's just, it's an aberration. But no, you as the licensor must be on top of this. Again, or you run the risk of damaging the reputation. Forget about losing the mark, but just damaging the reputation, which is the reason why you were able to get the licensing deal at the outset. So
beyond the formal Q&A, please feel free to reach out to any of us to get more information.
Be our pleasure. Thank you two very much.
All right. Thank you.